The bad news is that we have a rogue court that has been captured by special interests and that is over and over again in appalling pattern continuing to follow the direction of the billionaires and the front group through which they operate. The good news is that the public is fed up. Congress is fed up, mostly. And the Judicial Conference is beginning to tighten up the rules on the Supreme Court justices.
Rhode Island Democrat Sheldon Whitehouse has been ringing the alarm on the corruption of the Supreme Court and our desperate need to wrangle in their unchecked power, namely the infamous Clarence Thomas.
The court has done its best to prevent the American people from fighting back through the democratic process. It's made it harder for ordinary people to vote, while making it easier for billionaires and deep-pocketed special interests to impose their will on the American people with unlimited amounts of dark money. How did we get here? A decades-long scheme led by creepy billionaires and backed by a deluge of dark money captured the court like some crooked 19th century railroad commission. This court capture operation was not cheap. The latest estimate put it at more than $580 million, and that's a minimum. That money flowed in from creepy billionaires, laundered through right-wing front groups like the Federalist Society and Judicial Crisis Network, where the donors, the real donors, could hide their identities behind the front groups doing their dirty work. This dark money funded full-scale campaigns to stack the Supreme Court with justices who would deliver for the billionaires. Leo and his cronies also orchestrated a secret gifts program for their amenable justices, keeping them happy with lavish gifts of luxury vacations and other high-value freebies. Despite a clear federal ethics law requiring Supreme Court justices to disclose even small gifts, these justices kept hidden years of free private jet travel, free yacht trips, free tickets to sporting events, even for one justice, $260,000 of loan forgiveness for a luxury motor coach. Justices have flouted the federal law requiring recusal from cases where they have a conflict of interest. Justice Thomas sat on cases involving efforts to overturn the 2020 election, despite his wife's involvement in efforts to overturn the 2020 election.
This is exactly what we're talking about when we say that money has to get out of politics. In any other scenario with one party receiving something of value from another party under the condition that the first party will follow the second party's command, that would be called bribery and corruption. But in our political system, it's called gifting or donating, because the real power brokers, the billionaires, and the broader ultra-rich class need to soften the language and normalize the practice to avoid public outcry and thus stay in their position of power.
The Supreme Court now stands alone in all of government, free from any fact-finding about ethical misconduct. As a result, the court's legitimacy in the eyes of the American people is now at an all-time low and falling. The Supreme Court needs a binding, enforceable code of conduct. The Supreme Court should not violate one of the most basic principles of the law. Nemo judex in sua causa. No one should be a judge in their own cause. Yes, that is a principle so old and so venerated that it is in Latin, and they violate it non-stop. The justices of the Supreme Court should have ethics rules at least as strict as the other branches of government, with a real process for finding out what happened and holding miscreants accountable. And overwhelmingly, Americans agree.
While it is difficult, weeding out corruption in the Supreme Court and all levels of government is very achievable. It just takes the right people in positions of power to be motivated to do so.
My bill would also impose stricter disclosure of gifts justices receive, enhance existing recusal laws, and require the flotillas of phony front groups who lobby the court through friend of the court briefs to disclose their actual funders and connections. Democrats stand ready and willing to deliver on President Biden's and Vice President Harris's goal of bringing real transparency and accountability to the Supreme Court. President Biden and Vice President Harris also announced their support for 18-year term limits for Supreme Court justices, with new appointments to the court occurring every 2 years. That would counter the Republican Supreme Court justices' penchant for strategically timed retirements that tip the court into Republican hands. Term limits are a common-sense proposal with long bipartisan support. Supreme Court justices, including Chief Justice Roberts, have expressed support for term limits. Even some of our Republican colleagues have endorsed the idea. And a Fox News poll earlier this month showed that this idea has support from more than 75% of Americans. Vice President Harris, a former member of the Senate Judiciary Committee herself, has echoed the president's calls for reform. Both the president and the vice president have immense respect for our Supreme Court and for a strong and independent judiciary. They've demonstrated it through their lifetimes. And that is exactly why we should listen to them when they tell us that the time has come for reform at the Supreme Court. This has been a long and often lonely fight in the Senate. The big money right-wing apparatus has tried over and over to shut me up. I think I may have a record for hostile Wall Street Journal editorials. And may I tell the Wall Street Journal editorial board, thank you, that is a badge of honor.
So what I like about Whitehouse's speech is that he frames the issue of SCOTUS corruption primarily through the lens of economic investment rather than social investment. Because let's be clear, Harlan Crow isn't buddies with Clarence Thomas because they both want to end gay marriage. No, it's more so because Crow knows that Thomas is going to protect his financial interests. And the same goes really for any of the other bought and sold conservatives on the bench. I think Whitehouse brought up a lot of good options for reform at the Supreme Court level, number one being an enforceable code of ethics. Keyword enforceable, because there's no point in having a code of ethics if it isn't going to be enforced, right? And there needs to be a process to see, okay, did you actually violate the code of ethics? And if you did, what are the consequences? Are you going to be removed from the bench immediately, or will you get less severe penalties? Then there's another option that I think is really long overdue, term limits. How about an 18-year term limit? I think that's great because it gives the judges an incentive to get their work done in about 2 decades worth of work. So they're much more intentional and much more purposeful about how they shape this society, how they shape the country, because they know they're not going to be able to stay on the bench forever. And we can even extend that to senior justices. Like, when do we cut off Supreme Court justices from having the ability to stay on the bench? At what age? Now, I don't know the exact age. That's for smarter people. But there needs to be a time when your mind starts to decline and your cognitive abilities are not what they used to be when you were in your 40s, your 50s, even your 60s. That we say, okay, you need to leave, and we have to bring in new blood, a new generation, so to speak, a different perspective. The concern, though, I have with all these options, will we actually be able to see them through if Republicans control at least one branch of Congress or the presidency? Because we know the Republican Party has been about obstructing justice, halting progress, just in the name of it. Not because they don't believe in the idea, just we don't want things to get done. And I could be wrong, but that's my hunch, is that it won't be likely. So if Democrats, win the presidency and they can get control of Congress, that would be, or one branch of Congress, then that would be beneficial to making sure or helping speed up the process of these reforms being put in place. For Rebel HQ, I'm Chris Williamson. We'll see you next time.